In the vast archive of military engineering, certain machines stand out not merely for their size, but for the shadow they cast over history. Weapons forged at a time when the world was tearing itself apart, built not just to fight, but to break what was once believed unbreakable. Today we uncover the story of one such giant, a weapon so powerful, so rare, and so feared that American soldiers gave it a name that echoed across battlefields: the Black Dragon. This is the story of the 240mm Howitzer M1, the heaviest field artillery piece ever deployed by the United States Army in World War II. When World War II erupted, the United States possessed artillery that was effective, mobile, and reliable, but none of it was designed to shatter reinforced concrete fortresses built in the interwar years. Europe had changed. The Maginot Line, the Alpine fortifications, and Germany's growing Siegfried Line were built not for small arms fire, but to withstand explosive force on an unprecedented scale. The U.S. Army studied the campaigns of 1939 to 1940 with alarm. German 210mm guns had pulverized the Maginot Line's strongest bunkers. French and British reports repeatedly warned that standard 155mm artillery was inadequate against serious fortifications. American planners understood if the U.S. Army were ever forced to crack a fortified defensive belt, whether in Europe or the Pacific, it needed something far larger, more powerful, and capable of firing deep into hardened structures. The concept of a super-heavy field howitzer was revived from World War I experience. The U.S. had previously designed a massive 9.2-inch howitzer in 1918, but the war ended before it entered service. Its blueprints were pulled from storage. Engineers modernized them, improving metallurgy, recoil mechanisms, and carriage systems. The result was a weapon that, on paper, looked almost absurd. A 360-pound high-explosive shell, a range of 23 kilometers, and a barrel that required its own transport vehicle. By 1942, the design matured into what would become the 240mm Howitzer M1. Unlike rapid-fire field guns, this was a purpose-built siege weapon, slow to move, slow to emplace, but unmatched in destructive force. It was intended not for maneuver warfare, but for deliberate, methodical reduction of enemy strongpoints. The Army approved production. Contrary to early assumptions that only a handful were built, the wartime industrial push resulted in approximately 315 completed units by 1945, enough to equip multiple dedicated battalions. Each battalion was a specialized organization with heavy prime movers, cranes, ammunition trucks, and a well-trained 14-man operating crew supported by dozens of additional logistical personnel. The stage was set for America to unleash a weapon designed specifically to break walls, collapse bunkers, and obliterate structures the enemy believed untouchable. The 240mm Howitzer M1 was far more than a scaled-up artillery piece. It represented a complete rethinking of how to deliver massive explosive power in the field. Every part of its design served one singular purpose: to launch an enormous shell with extreme accuracy, even at long distances, without tearing itself apart in the process. At nearly 65,000 pounds in firing position, the M1 required a robust recoil system. Engineers developed a hydro-pneumatic mechanism capable of absorbing the enormous backward force generated by the 360-pound projectile. Without this innovation, the weapon would have buried itself backward into the earth with every shot. The barrel, almost 27 feet long, achieved a muzzle velocity of around 2,300 feet per second, producing enough kinetic energy to penetrate deeply into reinforced structures before detonation. The separate loading ammunition system allowed propellant charges to be varied, giving crews precise control over trajectory. This flexibility made the howitzer effective against targets ranging from deep bunkers to urban buildings or mountain positions. Transport was another engineering challenge. The M1 was split into two major loads. The barrel carried on a specialized barrel wagon, the carriage carried on a second heavy trailer. Both were hauled by M6 high-speed tractors, or later heavier Mack Prime movers. Even so, movement was slow. Curves, bridges, and soft ground all posed risks. Crews trained extensively in selecting safe routes and stable firing sites. Emplacement required a 20-ton crane, steel pads, and careful alignment. Under ideal conditions, well-trained crews could have the weapon ready in around 2 hours, though mud, snow, or enemy fire could extend this significantly. Once in position, the weapon's stability was exceptional. Its accuracy was one of its defining traits, a remarkable achievement for such a large-caliber piece. The shells themselves were masterpieces of wartime ordnance engineering. The standard high-explosive round was designed to create deep craters and pulverize reinforced concrete. A concrete-piercing variant had a thickened steel casing capable of punching into fortifications before detonation. Soldiers who operated it had immense respect for the weapon's power. When the first rounds fired during testing, the blast shockwave rolled across the range like a physical wall. It was then that crews began calling it by the name that would follow it into legend, the Black Dragon. The Black Dragon fired its first hostile shots not in France or Germany, but in the rugged terrain of Italy, a battlefield where traditional artillery often struggled. The German defensive lines, particularly the Gustav and Gothic lines, relied heavily on hardened bunkers, reinforced caves, and structures shielded by sheer terrain. The earliest deployment of the 240mm Howitzer M1 occurred in early 1944, supporting operations around Anzio and Monte Cassino. Allied progress had stalled against well-constructed German positions situated in mountains and ridges that smaller guns could not reach effectively. Heavy fortifications, deep observation posts, and tunnel networks dominated the landscape. When the 240mm arrived, its psychological impact was immediate. Its first long-range bombardments shook German positions so violently that many frontline units believed they were being shelled by naval guns. Crews targeted fortified artillery positions, blockhouses, and command bunkers. In several instances, German observers reported entire positions disappearing under the impact of a single round. At Monte Cassino, accuracy was essential. Allied commanders used the Black Dragon to strike specific structures that resisted standard bombardment. Its shells penetrated deeply into rubble and stone, collapsing German-held areas that had defied lighter artillery. The destruction of key strongpoints helped reduce the defensive integrity of the Gustav line and contributed to eventual Allied breakthroughs. In the Anzio beachhead, the 240mm countered entrenched German batteries that had pinned Allied forces for months. Its long range allowed Allied artillery to destroy enemy guns that had previously fired with impunity. Crews quickly gained reputations for precision, hitting targets that appeared nearly unreachable. Despite its immense value, moving the weapon in Italy's mountainous terrain was extremely difficult. Mud, narrow roads, and enemy fire slowed transport. In some cases, the cranes struggled to find stable ground. Yet the weapon delivered whenever it reached the battlefield. The Italian campaign proved the Black Dragon was not merely a siege weapon. It was a strategic asset, capable of altering the balance on hardened fronts. Its success in Italy ensured it would accompany Allied forces into Western Europe, where even greater challenges awaited. By late 1944, Allied armies stood before Germany's last great defensive system, the Siegfried Line, a belt of forts, casemates, obstacles, and bunkers extending hundreds of kilometers. Many structures were reinforced with steel and concrete several meters thick. Conventional artillery could damage these bunkers, but not reliably destroy them. The Black Dragon was brought forward for precisely this reason. Its deployment accelerated as U.S. forces prepared to breach fortified cities such as Brest, Metz, and later positions within Germany itself. One of the most significant uses of the 240mm occurred at Brest, where German paratroopers and naval personnel held out inside formidable defenses. The Black Dragon's shells cracked open major bunkers, collapsed tunnel entrances, and obliterated positions that had withstood weeks of continuous bombardment. After the surrender, German officers admitted that the heavy American howitzers were among the only weapons capable of breaking their strongest structures. Similar scenes unfolded around Metz, where medieval fortresses had been modernized with reinforced concrete. U.S. commanders deployed 240mm battalions to target artillery turrets, casemates, and interlocking bunkers. The long range allowed the weapons to fire from positions shielded from counter-battery fire. Their accuracy was vital. Many of the forts had limited vulnerable points, and the Black Dragon could place shells precisely onto those weak spots. As the Allies pushed into Germany, the weapon's assignments expanded. It engaged hardened industrial buildings converted into defensive positions, destroyed railway hubs vital to German logistics, and crushed complex bunker systems in the Eifel region. The Germans feared its firepower. Reportedly, soldiers in frontline defenses could feel the ground tremble seconds before the explosion reached them. The psychological effect was enormous. Many positions surrendered or withdrew after sustained bombardment. However, its limitations remained. The weapon was difficult to move quickly, and weather frequently slowed deployment. But when it fired, the results were decisive. By the end of the war in Europe, every shot fired by the Black Dragon represented the combined force of American industry, engineering, and artillery doctrine. It had become the most powerful field artillery piece ever used by the U.S. Army, one that left unmistakable marks on the final battles against Nazi Germany. With the end of World War II, many heavy artillery systems were rapidly retired as armies shifted toward mobility and mechanization. But the 240mm Howitzer M1 was too valuable to discard. Its destructive capability was unmatched, and military planners recognized that its ability to shatter fortifications remained relevant. The immediate post-war years saw several of these howitzers stored, maintained, and allocated to reserve battalions. Some were transferred to U.S. allies. Notably, Taiwan received several units, deploying them on islands such as Kinmen and Matsu, where they remained operational for decades facing mainland China. Their presence served as a powerful deterrent. Yet the Black Dragon's most significant post-war service came during the Korean War, when North Korean and later Chinese forces entrenched themselves in deep tunnel networks and fortified ridges. U.S. artillery commanders needed weapons capable of reaching into mountain positions with overwhelming effect. The terrain was severe. High ground, steep slopes, and deeply dug defensive complexes. The 240mm Howitzer M1 was reactivated and shipped to the peninsula. Once again, it proved its worth. Its enormous shells collapsed tunnels, destroyed hardened observation posts, and silenced enemy batteries hidden within rocky hillsides. The long range allowed American forces to strike fortified positions without exposing infantry or lighter artillery to counterfire. Unlike World War II, transportation in Korea presented even greater challenges. Roads were few, mud was constant, and the rugged landscape complicated emplacement. Yet the crews maintained the weapon with remarkable skill. When it fired, the results were unmistakable. Craters that reshaped the ground, enemy positions disappearing under clouds of debris, and crucial strongpoints neutralized before major offensives. By the mid-1950s, however, the future of super-heavy artillery was fading. The development of tactical nuclear weapons and more mobile gun systems rendered massive towed howitzers increasingly obsolete. The Black Dragon's era, defined by the smashing of concrete and steel with brute force, was ending, but its legacy endured. It had served across two major wars, broken some of the hardest fortifications of the 20th century, and demonstrated the pinnacle of American heavy artillery engineering. Even today, surviving examples in museums stand as reminders of a time when giant guns shaped the battlefield, a reminder of the Black Dragon's roar. In the end, the Black Dragon was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the industrial might of a nation at war, of the ingenuity of engineers, and of the determination of soldiers who moved, assembled, and fired a machine that seemed almost impossible. Today, only a handful remain, silent, immense, echoes of a time when giants roamed the battlefields. And yet their legacy endures, carved into the ruined fortresses they reduced to dust, and preserved in the memories of the men who saw the Black Dragon unleash its fury. This was the 240mm Howitzer M1, and you have been watching The Lost Record.